What the quarry workers pulled from the rubble of the Neander Valley that autumn was not the remnant of a single unfortunate creature. It was the first physical proof of an entire branch of the human family that no one had ever known existed. These people, for they were people, had lived across Europe and Western Asia for roughly 400,000 years, an expanse of time so enormous it dwarfs all of recorded human civilization by a factor of more than 100. Their range stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the frozen reaches of Siberia in the east, covering approximately 26 million square kilometers of some of the harshest terrain on the planet. They adapted to Ice Age cold, to open steppe, to dense forest, surviving conditions that would kill an unprepared modern human within a matter of days, and they did it for hundreds of millennia. For decades after Marcellin Boule's 1911 anatomical reconstruction, which deliberately exaggerated a stooped posture from a skeleton now known to have suffered severe arthritis, the Neanderthal was fixed in the public imagination as something lesser, a shuffling non-person. And that image proved almost impossible to dislodge. But the record refuses that picture. Neanderthals buried their dead, sometimes laying them to rest with ochre and, at certain sites, with what may have been flowers, arranging the bodies with what can only be described as intention. They made tools of considerable sophistication, worked from stone with techniques that required foresight, patience, and the passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. They controlled fire. And here is something that unsettles the old hierarchy. Quite possibly, they mastered it before Homo sapiens ever did. At the Krapina rock shelter in Croatia, archaeologists recovered 8 white-tailed eagle talons bearing cut marks, notches, and polished wear facets consistent with repeated stringing. The full suite of manufacture traces you would expect on worked jewelry, dated to roughly 130,000 years ago, with the eagle itself a bird of formidable size and cultural weight in every later society that encountered it. And on a cave wall in France, deliberate engravings have been dated to approximately 75,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before the first modern human ever set foot on the European continent. The pigment use, the engravings, the body ornaments. The quality of this symbolic record does not differ greatly from the earliest visual art we attribute to our own kind. And this is where the deepest misconception must be corrected. We did not evolve from Neanderthals. They were not our ancestors. They were our cousins. Our two lineages diverged from a common ancestor somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 years ago, then developed independently. They across the cold latitudes of Eurasia, while our own ancestors were being shaped in the heat of Africa. So consider what we are looking at. A species with endurance, adaptability, symbolic thought, mastery of fire, and hundreds of thousands of years of survival behind them. And then, roughly 40,000 years ago, within what is in geological terms scarcely an eye blink, they were gone. Roughly 50 to 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began dispersing into Europe and Western Asia, having already spent tens of thousands of years spreading out of Africa and across southern Asia. The window in which both species occupied overlapping territory, the coexistence period, may have lasted somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 years, though the precise duration remains contested and almost certainly varied a great deal from one region to the next. Now consider the numbers because they carry a weight that is difficult to hold in the mind. Estimates of the total Neanderthal population at any given moment range between 5,000 and 70,000 individuals, with the lower figures most commonly cited among researchers. The Homo sapiens population of the same era, meanwhile, likely exceeded 100,000 souls. Across that same 26 million square kilometers we noted when tracing their range, that translates to a density of roughly 2 10,000ths of an individual per square kilometer, closer to the population density of open ocean than of inhabited land. At many points in their history, the entire Neanderthal species may have contained fewer people than a single medium-sized town today. Europe between 50 and 35,000 years ago was passing through cycles of violent climatic instability. Cold snaps severe enough to contract forest cover and eliminate whole prey populations. These were conditions that tested every large mammal on the continent, forcing species into fragmented refuge zones scattered across a hostile landscape. But other species survived these fluctuations. The climate alone cannot close the case. Recent research suggests the Neanderthals had already weathered numerous glacial cycles across their long tenure. What truly changed with the arrival of Homo sapiens was not the climate alone, but the competitive and ecological landscape within which that climate played out. Then there is the matter of inbreeding. And here the story grows more intimate and more sorrowful. A 2024 study in cell genomics, led by Ludovic Slimak of the Université Toulouse Jean Jaurès and colleagues, found genomic evidence of significant inbreeding in one late Neanderthal male recovered from a cave in southern France, his genome bearing the patterns of a deeply isolated, genetically impoverished population. It reads at first like the perfect ending, a lineage folding inward on itself, running out of others to turn to. But newer research published in 2026 complicates that picture substantially, with researcher Alba Bossoms Mesa noting that the genomes show no evidence of increasing genetic load or reduced diversity over time, providing little support for the idea that genetic deterioration was the main cause of extinction. The evidence, characteristically, refuses to settle. So if it was not raw intelligence, not climate alone, and not genetic collapse, then where does the answer hide? It may lie somewhere far harder to see in the fossil record, in the invisible architecture of how groups of people reached one another across distances of hundreds of kilometers. The answer, it turns out, may be less about what Neanderthals were than about how they lived. To find that answer, we have to turn to the work of Professor Ariane Burke of the Université de Montréal, who moved the entire conversation out of biology and into something closer to social geography. Burke's research found that the areas suitable for Homo sapiens tended to be more physically interconnected than the territories used by Neanderthals, not because Neanderthals were poorer travelers, but because of where their lands happened to fall within the fractured landscape of Ice Age Eurasia. And when habitat patches are connected, when a band of hunters in one valley can reach, with real effort, another band in the next range, what emerges over generations is not simply movement, but infrastructure. Close-up. Hands drawing roots and animal shapes on hide, firelight, other figures listening. Information travels along those threads. News of prey migrations, of resource failures, of terrain that has turned dangerous. Partnerships form. Alliances extend across the miles. And critically, when one group faces a local catastrophe, a winter that kills the herds, a disease that takes the young, the network absorbs the blow, as other groups share territory, share food, and take in the survivors. Burke put it plainly. These networks act as a safety net, allowing for the exchange of information on resources and animal migrations, the forming of partnerships, and temporary access to other territories in the event of a crisis. And the word crisis deserves to sit with us for a moment, because that is precisely the condition under which the difference between a connected species and an isolated one becomes absolute. There was another force at work too, quieter and more structural. Neanderthals were robustly built, heavily muscled, broad-chested, adapted to the cold through sheer mass. And this anatomy, an advantage in freezing environments, carried a hidden metabolic cost. Each individual simply required more calories than a comparably sized Homo sapiens, which meant that the same land could support fewer of them per square kilometer. And if their diet leaned heavily toward meat, as the isotopic signatures locked inside Neanderthal bones suggest, then that inefficiency compounded further, because carnivores extract fewer total calories from a landscape than omnivores who gather plants as well. Smaller populations, spread more thinly, sealed off in isolated patches of suitable habitat. The architecture was already fragile long before the first Homo sapiens crossed the Bosphorus. Researchers have reached for a striking image to capture what this really means. The key differences between the two species lay less at the individual level than at the societal level. It is impossible to understand Homo sapiens in isolation, they argue, any more than you can understand a honeybee without ever considering its colony. Wide shot. Streams of people moving between distant settlements across a connected landscape. Dawn light. No enemy in sight, only empty distance. So this is not a story of Neanderthal failure. They were not out-thought. They were out-connected. Undone not by any deficiency of mind or character, but by the shape of the land beneath their feet. But there is a further complication. One the fossil record alone could never reveal. One that required the sequencing of ancient DNA to bring into focus. Because these two species did not simply compete, they met. For most of the 20th century, the story we told ourselves about human prehistory was essentially a replacement narrative. Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, Neanderthals vanished, and the two were imagined as having little contact beyond rivalry. Then the sequencing of ancient Neanderthal DNA, led most prominently by Svante Pääbo and the team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, dismantled that entire model in a single publication. The result rewrote the family tree. Neanderthal genes, it turned out, make up between 1 and 2% of the genomes of all non-African humans alive today. But that inheritance is not evenly distributed or inert. Specific Neanderthal variants cluster around immune response genes, keratin genes affecting skin and hair texture, and even variants now associated with altered pain thresholds and sleep cycles, suggesting that what was absorbed was not random noise, but selected signal. Across a global population of 8 billion people, that 1 or 2% is an inheritance carried by billions of living individuals, woven quietly into the bodies of nearly everyone whose ancestry runs outside Africa. And if a portion of the Neanderthal genome persists in us, selected for, in some cases, because it strengthened immunity, adapted skin, or improved tolerance to cold, then the very boundary between survival and extinction becomes genuinely difficult to draw. The species we call extinct left a ghost inside us, one that has never stopped functioning. Most likely in the Levant and Western Asia. Sites such as Skul, Kafse, and Mislia Cave, in what is now Israel, mark some of the earliest confirmed modern human presence outside Africa, where Homo sapiens moving north would have met Neanderthal groups first. It may also have occurred within Europe itself, during the long centuries when both peoples shared the same fractured, unforgiving continent. We cannot know the texture of these encounters, whether they were peaceful, violent, or simply the slow accumulation of border zone contact over generations. We can only read what the DNA retained. The Neanderthals are gone as a distinct population, gone as a lineage capable of reproducing itself forward in time. And yet the interbreeding means that the story of their disappearance is, by some lights, not quite a story of extinction at all, but of absorption, a much older, quieter, and perhaps more melancholy kind of ending. They are gone. And yet, in the blood and the code of billions, they are still here. Return now to that single Neanderthal man from southern France, the same individual whose genome we touched on when examining the inbreeding evidence. Because what Slimak and his colleagues found in that sequence runs deeper than a simple diagnosis of isolation. His DNA showed the signature of a deeply isolated population, inbred, genetically impoverished, thinned by generations of separation. This was not the mark of a single catastrophe, but the slow arithmetic of groups that never found their way to other groups, of a lineage quietly losing the thread of connection. We cannot know whether this man understood, in any conscious sense, that his world was contracting around him, but the genome remembers what he could not have named. And yet the newest research, published in 2026, refuses to let even this settle, because not all of the last Neanderthal populations showed the same signs of accelerating genetic decline. The extinction, it now seems, was not a single event, but a mosaic of local collapses. Some bands fading through isolation, others through competition, some perhaps lingering far longer than we yet know. A last few groups we can imagine holding on in the most remote and forgotten corners of a range that had once stretched across a continent. And here is what the whole story finally suggests: that the minimum viable unit of human survival was never the individual, and never even the small band. It was the network. The web of relationships reaching outward across distance and generation, carrying knowledge and food and diversity across the gaps that geography opens between us. This was the web that Homo sapiens maintained, and the web that Neanderthals, for reasons partly structural and partly ecological, could never sustain at the same scale. And here the deep past turns to face us, because we live now in a world of rising isolation, of fracturing information, of eroding trust between the groups that must somehow act together. The lesson this story carries is not a comfortable one. Intelligence, individual, even collective, is not sufficient. Connection is not a luxury. The history of a species whose cognitive reach exceeded every other on this planet suggests, with grim consistency, that survival was never about how clever a group was in isolation. It was about how well that group stayed woven into the lives of others, across the difficult and indifferent terrain of the world. Homo sapiens did not win because of bigger brains. We won because we refused, generation after generation, to be alone. Somewhere in the silence of an emptied cave, that older kindred still waits, remembered now at last not as brutes, but as us.